Consumer advocate Ralph Nader has been a longtime critic of the FAA, but unfortunately now it's personal. Nader's grandniece was aboard the Ethiopian Airlines jet that crashed earlier this month, shortly after takeoff, killing more than 150 people. New York Times now reporting that the 737 MAX plane, as well as the one that crashed in Indonesia last year, lacked two safety features that cost airlines extra to have on board. And then days after the crash, Nader posted an open letter to Boeing on his website calling for the company to ground its 737 MAX 8 planes. And in a recent interview with the Wall Street Journal, Nader suggested he's looking for any Boeing whistleblowers that might exist to come forward. Mr. Nader joins us this morning on the Squawk Newsline, and it's good to have you, Mr. Nader, and condolences on your grandniece. It's a personal issue for you now, and that's sad to hear.
That's a devastating. She had leadership, compassion, and intellectual rigor written all over her. Only 24 years old, and just was fearless in helping people. And she wanted to improve world health, and had worked in Africa when she was getting her degree in University of Copenhagen, and great in emergencies, the kind of leadership, Joe, that we look for in younger generations. She even had published papers in professional journals and was in high demand at professional conferences. So it's a devastating loss to her family, her many friends, all the passengers and crew, and the people who won't be helped by her in future years.
Hard to imagine the grief for her family at that age. Let me ask you just the crux of the issue, Mr. Nader. Do you think it's the relationship between FAA and Boeing, and we understand how that works? As a country, we're in competition constantly with other manufacturers, Airbus, China, et cetera, and is that where the real issue lies, would you think? Some type of incestuous relationship between the FAA and Boeing, or is it more in Boeing or the FAA individually where you think the problem lies?
Well, it's what the Inspector General, Department of Transportation, put out reports in recent years. They're too cozy with the FAA is too cozy with Boeing, and it's gone to an absurd length where Boeing picks its own inspectors. The FAA doesn't even pick its own inspectors. They're there in the factory, and they're pointing out different parts, and one Boeing employee says, "Oh, I think this meets the standard." The other one says, "I, as a representative of the U.S. government, endorse it," and then the FAA rubber stamps it. That's not regulation. That's the fox in charge of the chicken coop. And the fact that President Trump issued this executive order, 13771, after he was inaugurated, to knock out 2 regulations for every new one, has thrown these health and safety agencies into chaos. And believe it or not, and Forbes pointed this out yesterday, Forbes magazine, that Trump was cutting budgets. He wanted to cut the FAA budget, to cut the staff, and shove all the regulatory responsibility on Boeing. So that's what led to this kind of environment. And once you have a business strategy to try to compete with Airbus and you rush it, which is what Boeing did, here's the quick sequence. You want to sell the plane. So you have more seats. It creates a need for larger engines and into configuration, which affects the aerodynamics, which induces this flawed software, this time bomb software. And they say to the airlines, "Hey, this is just a minor modification. We don't have to give you detailed manuals for your pilots. We don't have to insist that your pilots be trained. You'll save all this money and buy this plane. It's better than Airbus." That's what happened.
Ralph, there's a story in the New York Times today that points out that many of the safety features that some planes have are not sold in others, that Boeing actually charges these as upgrades that go down, that in many of these countries don't have regulators saying you need these things. You think that's
right. They offer it as optional. What is this, like a car? They offer optional the warning light in case the sensors misfire and start pushing the nose of the airplane down against the will of the pilots. I mean, just imagine the horror of that. Pilots trying to push it upward, and this software is pushing it down. So they made the light optional. They made the indicator optional. They're going to change that now. My message to Boeing is really quite simple. All the grisly details are going to come out. They're going to come out with congressional hearings, with Department of Transportation hearings, with whistleblowers, with tort lawsuits, with the media on top of it. So Boeing, in its own interest, better behave accordingly in the coming months and not try to fight it, not try to use its 100 full-time lobbyists in Washington to get its way, not to keep pumping money into over 300 members of Congress who take campaign cash, and they better straighten out, because once a plane gets a stigma, like the 737 MAX 8 and 9, one seat, consumers organize a boycott. Once they say to the airlines they don't want to fly this plane, it's going to be very hard for Boeing to turn it around. So the CEO of Boeing, in Japan, the CEO would have resigned. The CEO of Boeing better straighten out and stop looking at this as a lobbying and public relations challenge only.
Ralph, the plane was approved to fly by many, many aviation authorities around the world. What do you make of that particular aspect?
Well, they take the lead from the U.S. because the U.S. plane, and in past years, the Boeing 737 in the U.S. has had a good safety record, less so in other countries. And so they just rubber stamp the FAA. They don't have the facilities in a lot of these developing countries to do otherwise. But now it's changing. I mean, now the image of the FAA and the reputation of Boeing are at stake. And what they really should have done was gone to the 737-900, had a cleaner slate plane, but they thought that would take too much time, and they were losing sales to the Airbus competitor. And it's all about rushing. It's all about profits. It's all about telling the airlines, this is an easy fix. You don't have to spend time. You know, there was a pilot on the hotline to the NSA, on the hotline to NASA. They have a traditional hotline so they can tell NASA what happened in the air episode. And one of the pilots called in and said that the training manual for the 737 MAX, quote, was criminally insufficient, unquote. So the Justice Department and the FBI are investigating. This is not just a civil matter, it's a criminal matter.
Do you think, Ralph, that given the safety record for the last 10, 15 years with Boeing, maybe they earned a lot of goodwill, I guess. Maybe the FAA did too. I mean, it's pretty staggering how, I mean, these planes are marvels of modern technology, but this looks like it may have been, you know, some of the things that you were talking about may have been at play here. But in general, the safety record is like, you know, compared to anything else you do, it's about the safest thing you can do, right?
It was a good safety record in this country, but, you know, there's such a thing as Boeing pushing the envelope too far, using robotics, using automation, using artificial intelligence to overpower the pilots.
Well, now you sound like the president.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the point here
I'm sure that
is you can have a good safety record, but it's like stretching a rubber band. You know, you stretch the rubber band to meet the purpose around, and then you stretch it, and then it snaps.
What would the whistleblower, where do you think the whistleblower would come from, and what type of information would you, you know, this is all obviously just speculation, but what type of information would you expect to garner from a whistleblower? From the FAA, from Boeing, from where? Well,
they're going to come from all over. Some of them will be retired aerospace people, some will be from Boeing, some will be from FAA. The congressional committees that are announced investigations have to give subpoenas to these people to protect them from retaliation. And so the Senate and House hearings are going to be starting soon. But what would spill out would be things like this. Who were the technical dissenters? There were apparently heated discussions between Boeing, FAA, pilots, etc. The pilots union has told the pilots to shut up and not talk to the media. Imagine that. It's like they have no independent conscience of their own. The other thing was, who made the decisions in Boeing? Was it made at the top? Was there pressure from the management, which seems likely to push the engineers to move fast, move fast, move fast, get this stuff out? Don't put strong manuals in print. Don't require pilot training. And then the other thing is who rubber stamped it in the FAA. The Secretary of Transportation has now opened an investigation on that. And then the other thing that was really critical is why they didn't make these warning indicators and lights standard equipment. So there are a lot of questions, and there's going to be huge investigations. But some of these investigations can turn into whitewashes. The members of Congress shout in front of the TV at the Boeing executives, and then there's a wink, and then nothing is done. So I think Flyers' Rights, which is an offshoot from our older consumer group, the Aviation Consumer Action Group, flyersrights.org is what people should go to for consumer protection information. And, gee, we really need a big aviation consumer organization in this country, because in the ultimate analysis, it's the media and the airline passengers that are going to drive this to the truth and prevent other crashes from happening, and to make sure that this artificial intelligence monster does not get out of control and overpower human intelligence.
Ralph, I share your skepticism and concern about a lot of these issues that you've highlighted today, but we don't know all the facts yet, and some of the things that you've said may or may not be borne out. If it's
well, we do know the facts about inadequate pilot training. You have many pilots quoted in the media recently. We know the facts of inadequate manual. We know the facts that they had safety indicator and lights as options. And above all, we know that there is an anomaly here that usually Boeing goes from the 737, 600, 700, 800, 900. Why didn't they go to the 900? Why did they go to the MAX? And how fast was the process?
My point being that there are still answers that are to come.
Yeah, there's more answers to come, of course. That's what the investigations are for. But it's pretty troubling to see the business strategy that led to the deaths of those innocent people in Indonesia and Ethiopia.